welcome, Mike. It's so good to have you.
Really great to be here with you, LUIVETTE.
Thank you. I'm super excited about this. As a friend, as a fellow poet, co-organizer, I'm really excited to talk about your new collection. But some people don't know who you are. I have the pleasure of knowing who you are. So, God, please, who is Mike Sonksen?
Mike Sonksen, well, AKA Mike the Poet.
Right.
Third generation Southern Californian. I'm a poet, now a professor, but started out in the LA spoken word poetry scene and also grew up as a tour guide and a historian and lover of California, and also just building community through poetry, talking about history and geography, and for that matter, family, and connecting the dots between different elements, interdisciplinary, really. So I'm a writer most of all, but I think I owe so much of who I am to poetry and to the community, and so a lot of my identity really came through the poetry scene. And I feel like in my 20s, I found myself through poetry and through Los Angeles and the different neighborhoods where open mics were. And
What were some of your favorite places when you first started spoken word? What were some of your favorite spots that may or may not still be around?
You know, we used to do these really organic places. I mean, first,
Who's we?
You know, I got to give a shout out to my good friend Philip Martin, AKA Phil Harmonic, and who's now he's a soccer coach, but he's still a poet and a painter as well. And Phil and I we were doing venues like this place called Underwords in Culver City, and it was in this like warehouse, and it was this guy's live-in workspace / warehouse thing, and there was a spot at the Westwood Brewing Company, and it was this open mic called the House of Green, and it was poets, and it could be acoustic singer-songwriters, sometimes a comedian, sometimes a punk rock band, sometimes a little hip-hop, but it was these really eclectic open mics. Then we went to places like the Onyx, which was in Los Feliz, and we then found out about places like Beyond Baroque and the World Stage, and I think I went to Beyond Baroque 3, 4, 5 times before I ever did a poem there. And I remember hearing about Beyond Baroque on KCRW in the 90s, you know, before I ever went there. And so there was a lot of Midnight Special Bookstore, which is gone now, but that was on the 3rd Street Promenade, and that was a beautiful bookstore, one of my favorite bookstores. And so these bookstores, these galleries, these community art centers, they were really where it all started.
Wow, that's awesome. And now you organize, you host events now at those spaces. Beyond Baroque, I'm thinking in Avenue 50, you've done stuff there, and it's kind of full circle for you, right?
Yeah, you know, the first open mic that I ever hosted was at a place called Cafe Muse on Olympic and Sawtelle, and it was this bar, and it was this bar in the restaurant, and we lived around the block from there, but the guy who owned it was really cool. And so we used to host an open mic there in 1999 called Volcanic Vibes every Saturday night. And we would have DJs, and we had DJs and poets and hip-hop MCs and singer-songwriters. And we were always trying to unite styles. Sometimes in the poetry scene there are these different communities and these camps. But we were literary, and we were hip-hop, and we were into, my friend Phil was a painter, and we knew graffiti artists, and we knew DJs. And we were all of these things. So we were trying not to have any divisions. And these open mics were a lot of fun, but they were also where we were creating our chosen family, and some of us were coming out of divorced families. So a lot of it was, we were creating the world that we wished we'd been in already.
This is your second edition of Letters to My City. I have both editions, and I'm really curious, what is the difference for people who may not know, what's the difference between the first and second? What did you add? What did you delete, if anything?
The second edition is 2 new essays and a teaching guide, and I think I corrected a few small typos, but it's also me closing some loops. And I was thinking about a few topics, and you know how when you're meditating on something, and so the 2 new essays, one is about Mike Davis, my mentor who had passed, and then another essay was part memoir, part manifesto, and it was me thinking more and more about what I've been doing all these years. And the essay is titled A Local History of Time and Space. And that essay is articulating why I write what I write, but also how it connects to my students, and how, as we explore our own history, as we explore our own geographies, we connect to more of our own identity, but it also empowers other people to connect to their identity. And there's this quote from Wendell Berry, if you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. And then I think Malcolm X had a quote, if you don't know where you've been, how are you going to know where you're going?
Right.
And so those ideas, this essay, A Local History of Time and Space, is me also reflecting on, it's also kind of a part two of this other essay I had earlier in the book about being a tour guide, the idea of community, not a commodity, and how we can use history and geography not to sell real estate, but for really meaningful, deeper purposes.
I don't necessarily see it as a tour guide. I see it as an experience. You're giving people an education about a very particular part of Los Angeles that they may never have known about, even people who are local, right?
Absolutely.
Right?
I couldn't agree more, and the tour will make you feel the history. You can,
Right.
I can talk all day long about the history of Los Angeles, but then if I take them to Judy Baca's Great Wall of Los Angeles and there's this 2,800 foot long mural that's a 10,000 year history of LA, they can look at that mural and see all of these communities and all of that history, and that mural can tell the story so much more. I'll show some slides and I can talk about some bullet points in class, but when I take them to see that mural, or when I take them down to First Street in Little Tokyo and we walk down the street and we look at the timeline and we look at the different buildings, all of that is more concrete evidence of what the city really is.
Well, I'm going to ask you more about that in a second, but can you please go ahead and read A Local History of Time and Space, or an excerpt?
All history is local, it happened here, writes James W. Lowen in his influential book Lies Across America. Local history and geography are recurring themes in my life. I've written countless poems and essays in the last 25 years that in one way or another center around some facet of local history and geography. I've also been giving city tours spotlighting local history, geography, and architecture since 1997, and over the last 15 years as a teacher on both the high school and college level, I've used these subjects in every class I teach to activate students and get them invested in their local geographies. Moreover, in this technological age where society has become more depersonalized and many people feel disconnected, learning local history offers a direct connection to the world. Among the countless positive outcomes this leads to, one of the most important, as Lowen writes in his books Lies My Teacher Told Me, is that students can locate themselves in the social structure. Ultimately, students' interest in their own locality makes a great segue towards civic engagement, service learning, personal values, and even identity and belonging. These same results transfer to anyone that takes the time to engage local history, no matter their age. To learn local history is empowering and helps one become more of an engaged citizen of wherever they are. In some cases, it can even connect folks to their ancestors and forgotten family stories. There's actually, if you'll let me to go off topic or off the book for a minute,
Sure.
I have a student named Alec Figueroa, and I actually mentioned him in the same essay, but Alec is a really interesting guy because he said he never liked history and he never liked geography, but he was in my class and he's a game design major. But we talked about the San Gabriel Valley, and we talked, he grew up in Monterey Park and Rosemead, and we talked about that book, The Changs Next Door to the Diazes, written by Wendy Chang, that's about the history of Asian and Latino immigration and sort of how the Asian and Latino populations helped recreate the San Gabriel Valley. And I spoke about that, and I talked about Monterey Park being the first city in America to have an Asian American majority. And Alec comes up to me after class and says, you know, my mother is Vietnamese and my father's Mexican. He says, I am the San Gabriel Valley.
Oh, sweet.
And he said, you know, I never really cared about, I liked growing up in Monterey Park, but I never really paid any attention to history and geography, but you talking about that made me interested. Everywhere you go, there's always a backstory, and whether it be a cool building or whether it be a mural or...
It humanizes these spaces, right?
It's completely humanizing. And as far as something like gentrification, if you go to almost any city in the last few years, we did the AWP in Portland, and then we were doing AWP in Philadelphia, and then we did it in Seattle. And all three of those cities, I saw similar condos with the Starbucks on the bottom. And these cities look more and more all alike.
Right.
But when you find out the backstory, when you find out that there was this mom and pop restaurant there, and now there's a thing where all the graffiti artists in LA used to paint it called the Belmont Tunnel, but that originally had been a 1.5 mile tunnel that went from downtown LA to where now it's historic Filipino town, almost to Echo Park, and it was a 1.5 mile. It was actually a little subway tunnel, and it connected to the Pacific Electric red car, it connected to the streetcar system. Well, that tunnel was left open, but the train hadn't run since the late 50s. But in the 80s and 90s, all the LA graffiti artists painted in the Belmont Tunnel. And guys I knew used to paint murals in the Belmont Tunnel. Well, now there are condos there, and it's called Belmont Station.
Oh my gosh.
When I'm writing a poem about Leimert Park, or when I was writing a poem about Venice or Boyle Heights, I spent hundreds of hours in those neighborhoods, at my friends' houses, at poetry gigs. When I was writing a poem about the 626, I was living in the 626. And when I was writing about running around the West Side, or when I was writing about going to LA live music venues, that's what we did in the 90s, is we just went to a million hip-hop shows and punk rock shows and after-hour parties. And I like that kind of participant observer type, boots on the ground.
You mentioned the 626 a few seconds ago. I'm going to ask you to read the poem, The 626, because I live in the 626, and I've been living there for 20 years, and I'm really proud that I come from the SGV. So if you can you read the 626?
I will, yeah, I'm going to find that.
134.
130, oh, thank you so much. Hey, speaking of 134, that's one of the major freeways of the 627.
I was going to say, was that intentional?
You know, that's just...
Is that intentional?
That was some serendipity.
Just say it was.
Yeah.
Just say it was.
Yeah.
Just say, yeah, it was totally intentional.
It was totally on purpose. And how that 134 segues into the 210. So the 626. An abundant landscape of locations, people, and culture exist in the 626. The crown city in this multicultural mix is undoubtedly Pasadena. A century ago, citrus groves stretched from Redlands to Azusa. This was decades before tract homes were built in Temple City and Covina. The agricultural scenery was gradually decimated by freeways. 3 centuries earlier, the Spanish built the mission in San Gabriel. The Pueblo of Los Angeles was founded a decade after the Padres built San Gabriel. Spanish colonization created the foundation for LA and the future 626. Never in their wildest dreams did the Franciscans envision freeways. During the Victorian era, old money Yankees built the mansions in Pasadena. By the mid-20th century, there was La Puente, Monrovia, Rosemead, and West Covina. Arteries like Garvey Valley and Huntington connected these cities to Azusa. The San Gabriel watershed begins in the hills above Azusa. The Angeles National Forest is in the mountains above San Gabriel. Traveling east from Alhambra to El Monte to Covina, there are well over a dozen cities in the area code 626. California bungalows and craftsman cottages dominate South Pasadena. The protective residents of South Pass stop the 710 freeway. The 10, 210, 710, 60, and 605 are an intricate web of freeways. Back in the day, Route 66 on Foothill Boulevard bisected Azusa. The Rose Bowl and Rose Parade celebrate the spirit of Pasadena. Appalachia was replaced by Sriracha in the valley of San Gabriel. Boba milk tea and dim sum are now iconic in the 626, along with shopping malls and IKEA off the freeway in Covina. They filmed part of Back to the Future in West Covina, the DeLorean seen in the mall just south of the 60 freeway. The 57 freeway is a boundary between the 909 and 626. Duarte and Sierra Madre are neighborhoods west of Azusa. Spanish colonial revival McMansions and pho eateries are in San Gabriel. If you drive north on Rosemead, you'll end up in East Pasadena. PCC, Art Center, and Caltech are colleges in Pasadena. Mount Sac and Azusa Pacific are colleges east of Covina. Santa Anita and Arcadia is a landmark north of San Gabriel. This cluster of locations is rimmed by foothills and freeways. In-N-Out Burger started in Baldwin Park just west of Azusa. This huge pocket between LA and the Inland Empire is a 626. Travel from Pasadena to Pomona on the freeways, or take Arrow Highway from Covina to Azusa. The Changs lives next door to the Diaz's in the San Gabriel Valley in 626.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Lizette.
I recognize all of this, right? Living in the 626, and so I'm smiling. I was going to ask you a couple questions real quick. You know, is there a city or neighborhood that you haven't had a tour yet?
When I worked for Redline Tours, the 2 main tours that would have us do walking tours were Hollywood Boulevard and Broadway in historic downtown LA. And those were some of my starting points, but I also used to do bus tours. I've done bus tours, I've done walking tours, I've done quite a few different tours over the years. And then I started with the Museum of Architecture and Design in 2007. We used to do one called the Urban Hike, and we did tours that usually about 90 minutes or 2 hours, you know, 2-3 block walking tour. I really like Uptown Whittier. You know where else I like? Close to you is Monrovia. Monrovia is a really interesting city, and I found out that it's the 4th oldest city in Los Angeles County.
Oh.
Only LA, Pasadena, and Santa Monica are older than Monrovia. And Monrovia's got some really killer craftsmen And their library was built by the Carnegie. The Carnegie was building all these libraries at the turn of the 20th century. And you're just below, you know, Mount Wilson. And so I like Monrovia. It's an interesting city, and Myrtle Avenue is a cool little street too. A couple of little bookstores. And so I like Monrovia a lot. And you know, I even like Torrance. Torrance is interesting. And when Torrance was first built, it was a combination of industry, commercial, and residential. And the Olmsted brothers, their father was the one who designed Central Park, and Frederick Law Olmsted was, you know, maybe the greatest landscape architect of all time. His sons became landscape architects, and they designed the city of Torrance, and they actually also designed Leimert Park. These little neighborhood downtowns are so quaint, and there's a bunch of them, actually quite a few in the 626. Even like San Dimas, and they all have these little...
San Dimas is a very interesting town.
Cute little downtowns.
That is in the Western vibe.
These little places have more soul than, you know, the only way you find out about them is when you get out there. And some of them I found out from having a lot of poetry readings there. Some of them were from also just friends. And but these little neighborhoods to me are much more interesting than Sunset and Hollywood and Melrose.
So maybe you'll do a tour of Monrovia, Whittier, or obviously Whittier is already on there, but like Monrovia for sure, and that's not too far from me. I'll definitely...
You know, and if we do a tour of Monrovia, we're going to have you do a poem on it, so...
Sure. In front of one, there's a great bookstore that just opened up a few months ago. It's called the Underdog Bookstore. That is right there across the street from the library.
Teresa Maychuk was telling me about that.
Yes, it's a really... I haven't been, but I've communicated with that bookstore, and I cannot wait to check them out. You talked about Mike Davis, and he definitely is a huge influence for you. I've heard you talk about Mike, you know. Talk to me a little bit before we close out, is how important are mentors?
I've had a number of different mentors, and some more than others. Mike Davis is probably the primary one, but you know, sometimes you have a mentor for a season too. Like even the tour guiding job I had, the first tour guiding job I had, there was a guy who kind of mentored me about, hey, when you talk about these facts, be real specific and talk about this and talk about that. And so I think mentors help you. You might be on the road a little bit, but they help you really get on the road. They help you really get into your lane. And Mike Davis, you know, gave me books, and he was encouraging. And I remember I read him some of my first LA poems in 1997. And he just looked at me and said, those are cool, keep writing them. You know, he didn't even say too much. He just said, keep writing them. And he invited us over to his house. He had the class over at his house for pizza. And he let us look through his bookshelves. And he let me look at an outline of an article that he was working on at the time. And it was like a 2,000-word article. But the outline had 7 or 8 little bullet points. Okay, intro, 150 words, these body paragraphs. And I don't make an outline all the time, but maybe 3/4 of the time I might make a quick little outline in my journal. And so just seeing his outline even was really helpful.
You know, the thing about this collection is that there's no way you can, I mean, in my opinion, again, I don't think there's one word to describe it, right? You can't put this in a box and say, oh, this is a poetry book, this is this is a collection of essays. It really is doing so many things successfully, right? Because it is an essay collection. It is an homage to LA. It is an homage to Mike Davis. It's honoring Luis Rodriguez, Wanda Coleman, and the LA writing scene as a whole. But then at the end, like you said, you added this, you know, because you're an educator, you added basically, this is how you know, a curriculum, right, for it, which I was looking at as well. I was like, I'm stealing some of these for sure. But it's almost like it's a textbook and it's an oral workbook. You can look at it that way, but it's, so this collection, the second edition, that's what one of the things I really appreciate is that you can't put it in a box. It shouldn't be put in a box. It's history, it's, as we mentioned, anthropology, it's ethnography. There's so much going on here, which is amazing and beautiful.
Thanks
and
for
I
getting
love
it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the fact that it's not monolithic, right? It's not going to be that. So what's next? So you did this, you did both editions, so what's...
I'm working on, I have a new collection of poems that's almost done, Traces, Places, Faces. And then I have a book of essays almost done titled Urban Alchemists, and that is about muralists, and there's even a third collection about poets that's essays that's pretty close to being done.
Nice. To me, it makes sense to close out with your poem for Wanda Coleman.
Yeah. You know, to this day, I mean, Wanda published close to 20 books. I think she published 20, 21 books. She's probably written more poems about LA than just about anybody. And you know, they always say Bukowski was the most famous LA poet, but I even defer to Wanda. I like Wanda even more than Bukowski. Like,
yes.
I loved Bukowski when I was 19.
Right.
As every young dude does, you know. But
right.
But Wanda was published on Black Sparrow Press, and she told me that she was never officially a part of the Watts Writers Workshop, but she had been born in Watts, and she said a lot of her career was kind of going back and forth between Watts and Hollywood. And she won a daytime Emmy. She briefly wrote even a little bit for some soap operas. But Wanda had a very interesting career, and she was only 67 when she passed. And for a long time, they called her the unofficial Poet Laureate of Los Angeles.
Right.
And the interesting thing is that by the time they finally had a Poet Laureate, our first one was Alois Klein Healy, who was around the same age as Wanda. Wanda had no longer lived in LA, and she was under the weather, and you know, she passed a year or two later. And so I wish they would have started the Poet Laureate program earlier, because Wanda would have been the one.
Yeah.
Wanda would have been the one. But I met Wanda in about 2002, and I had been reading her from the mid-90s, and she could be very blunt, and she could be kind of, she was fiery and she was opinionated, but she was always very kind to me. And I would email her all the time, and she would write me back. And I interviewed her twice. I did an essay on her in 2003 for the LA Alternative Press, and then I interviewed her at Cal State LA about 6 months before she passed.
Oh, wow.
But this poem, One for Wanda, is just me paying tribute to her, and you know, we love her. And also Beyond Baroque is dedicating their theater to Wanda Coleman. And there's a great up-and-coming poet named Mimi Tempest, who's from LA, but she's been up in the Bay Area. She's doing her PhD thesis on Wanda, and she's got a new book coming out from City Lights. And so Wanda is really, here it is almost 10 years after. It's actually going to be the 10-year anniversary of her passing. But let me get into the poem, but we can't say enough about Wanda. Hey Wanda, one of the last moves Austin made before he split the planet, make sure the Ascot branch of the Los Angeles Public Library was dedicated to you. Remember the library you ran to when you needed a place to escape so long ago? Dozens of your books are now on the shelf below a framed copy of your Los Angeles Times obituary. A dozen feet from your section, 4 tables are set aside as a student zone for homework help. Black and brown teens huddle in a circle completing worksheets while a young woman explains equations. A 7th grade boy chased his younger brother while their mother reads a magazine. In 1957, you chased your dream to be a published author sitting in these chairs. The librarian can no longer admonish you for staying late. Your dream walks down Main across San Pedro through Florence Firestone set off a landslide of poems bearing witness to African sleeping sickness. Apply the mercuriochrome, a young girl sleeps in her mother's arms. The California condor are gone, but your books remain stacked on the west wall. Hear the footfalls from children down the hall. You were a native in a strange land. You drank a lifetime of bathwater wine. Morning after morning, there wasn't a pill you didn't swallow. You were in touch beyond cliches, erasing all the names of the betrayers. Your crowning glory on the page, channeling blues beyond Broadway. A chorus of cosmic American sonnets broadcasting honest truth. You asked, who will sing your praise song? I assure you, we are many. Your resurrection reverberates through the firmament. We will never forget you, Wanda. Miss Coleman, you put our city on the map. You made history. Without you, this city is a pale, rude fiction. I drove to Florence in Maine to say your name. After visiting your library, I cruised down San Pedro past Fremont High School. You said it's insanity writing poetry in Los Angeles. Yes, this is true, but something significant has happened here. You liberated a generation of bards, sending us down boulevards and avenues to locate the landscape vernacular. Poetry alone cannot contain your gravitas. Driving down Avalon up to 76th Street near your childhood home, I feel the mercury burning this late afternoon. I remember your flamethrower cocktail of kindness, your uncompromising vision. Without you, this city is pale, rude fiction.
Thank you.
Thank you, LUIVETTE.
Thank you. And I think your poetry actually liberates a generation of bards. So I think that's what you do.
Thank you, thank you.
And that's a given with your students that you, I mean, that's the concrete evidence. So thank you, though. I really appreciate it.
Thank you
for coming.